The blood on the hospital floor wasn't from a patient. It was from the janitor's hands, shaking as he stared at the young Marine's tattoo. Because 50 years ago, in a jungle nobody talks about, he'd seen that same mark on a body he carried for 6 miles. And now, in this sterile corridor that smelled of disinfectant instead of death, the past had found him again. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of recognition, healing, and brotherhood that spans generations of warriors, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this need to be remembered, hit that subscribe button. These voices have been silent too long, and they deserve to be heard. The Minneapolis VA Medical Center stands like a fortress against the brutal Minnesota winters. 7 stories of institutional brick and government-issued steel, housing America's walking wounded, the healing, the broken, the forgotten, and the ones who wish they could forget. Its corridors have witnessed more genuine heroism than most battlefields, absorbed more tears than most confessionals, and kept more secrets than the Pentagon. Built in 1952, this building has seen 3 generations of American warriors pass through its doors. Korean War veterans with frostbite scars and 1,000-yard stares. Vietnam vets who came home to protests instead of parades. Gulf War soldiers dealing with mysterious illnesses nobody wanted to acknowledge. Iraq and Afghanistan veterans whose wars never really ended, just moved from the desert to their dreams. Within these walls, fluorescent lights hum their eternal song 24 hours a day, casting long shadows that seem to hold the echoes of conversations between doctors and patients who are both trying to understand what service really costs. Day shifts blur into night shifts like pages in a book nobody wants to read. Nurses become doctors, patients become statistics, heroes become case numbers, but the building itself remains constant, a lighthouse of healing built on foundations of service, sacrifice, and silence. James Mitchell had walked these halls for exactly 30 years, 4 months, and 12 days. Not that anyone was counting. Not as a doctor with his white coat and medical degree hanging on an office wall. Not as a nurse with her scrubs and compassionate bedside manner honed by years of seeing too much suffering. Not as a therapist with his psychology degree and carefully practiced understanding nods. James was the night shift janitor, invisible, silent, essential, and completely unremarkable to everyone who saw him. Every weeknight at exactly 10:47 p.m., his beat-up 1998 Ford F-150 would pull into the employee parking lot. The same spot every time, 3rd row from the building, under the flickering streetlight that the maintenance department had been promising to fix for 6 months. He'd sit behind the wheel for exactly 3 minutes, finishing the last of his thermos coffee, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, preparing his mind for another 8-hour journey through America's most hidden battlefield. The coffee was always the same, black, strong enough to strip paint, brewed in a machine he'd owned since 1985. No sugar, no cream, no modifications. Just caffeine and determination in a dented thermos that had seen more miles than most people's cars. He'd bought it at a truck stop in North Dakota during his first year out of the service, when he was still trying to figure out what civilian life was supposed to look like. At 11 p.m. sharp, he'd clock in through the staff entrance on the building's north side. Badge swipe, timestamp, the soft electronic beat that announced another night of invisible service. His employee ID photo showed a man 20 years younger, back when he still believed that staying busy could keep the memories quiet. Now his hair was gray, his face lined with decades of night shifts and careful solitude, but his eyes still held the alertness of someone trained to notice what others missed. The supply closet was his command center, organized with the precision of a man who understood that chaos in small things led to chaos in large things. Industrial cleaning supplies arranged not just neatly, but strategically. Floor cleaner, disinfectant, glass cleaner, trash bags, spare mops, each item in its designated place. Each tool serving its purpose in the larger mission of keeping this place of healing as clean and safe as human effort could make it. His cart was loaded the same way every night, following a checklist he'd memorized but still went through step by step because good habits prevented bad surprises. Mop bucket secured with bungee cords, supplies organized by frequency of use, spare cleaning rags folded and stacked according to size. To any casual observer, it looked like the routine of any institutional janitor trying to get through his shift without causing problems. But James Mitchell moved with a different kind of purpose, a precision that spoke of training most civilians never received and experiences most would never want. Every step was calculated, every movement efficient, every action serving multiple purposes. He cleaned floors, but he also observed. He emptied trash bins, but he also listened. He restocked supplies, but he also remembered. James Mitchell had spent 30 years perfecting the art of being invisible in plain sight. It was a skill the Marine Corps had taught him in jungles where being seen meant death, refined through decades of civilian life where being noticed meant questions he didn't want to answer. The hospital staff saw him the way people see streetlights or fire extinguishers, necessary, reliable, but not requiring conscious thought. Day shift nurses rushing past during the chaotic 11 p.m. changeover barely registered his presence as anything more than another piece of hospital equipment. Their minds were focused on patient handoffs, medication schedules, and the 100 small crises that defined their 12-hour shifts. Night doctors grabbing stale coffee and energy bars from vending machines saw him as part of the building's infrastructure, as unremarkable as the heating system or the emergency lighting. To the patients lying restless in their beds, fighting battles against pain and memory that no medication could completely silence, he was just the soft whisper of wheels rolling past their doors in the darkness. A sound that meant someone was working while they tried to heal, someone was maintaining order while they struggled with chaos. But James saw everything, remembered everyone, and understood more than any of them could imagine. He saw Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez in room 314, the Afghanistan veteran who hadn't slept more than 2 consecutive hours since his medical discharge 8 months ago. Rodriguez had been a convoy leader, responsible for getting supplies through some of the most dangerous roads in Helmand Province. 3 successful tours, dozens of missions, hundreds of soldiers who made it home because Rodriguez knew how to read the landscape for signs of trouble. Until the day he didn't see the IED buried under a pile of construction debris on a road his convoy had used successfully 20 times before. The blast had taken his hearing in his left ear and his confidence in his ability to protect anyone, including himself. Now, every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., Rodriguez would wake up screaming, sweat-soaked sheets tangled around his legs like the twisted metal that had decorated his Humvee after the explosion. The night nurses would come running. Sandra Williams, a former Army medic who understood military trauma better than most, and Dr. Patricia Chen, whose gentle manner masked a steel core forged by years of emergency medicine. They'd offer medication, provide comfort, check vitals, and do everything medical science could recommend. But James knew that some wounds couldn't be medicated away, some fears couldn't be counseled into submission. He saw Lieutenant Sarah Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, despite sharing a surname, in the ICU, the Navy corpsman turned trauma nurse who sometimes disappeared into the supply closet after losing a patient. James had found her there twice in the past month, sitting on the floor among the surgical supplies, her shoulders shaking with the weight of trying to save everyone while knowing that medicine had limits, that skill had boundaries, that sometimes people died despite every effort to keep them alive. Lieutenant Chen had served 2 tours as a field medic, patching up Marines under fire, keeping men alive long enough for helicopters to evaluate them to proper medical facilities. She'd been good at her job, exceptional, according to her service record. But civilian nursing was different. In combat, you did your best and accepted that some outcomes were beyond human control. In a hospital, families expected miracles, insurance companies demanded efficiency, and administrators measured success by statistics that didn't account for the weight of individual losses. James never intruded on her grief, never offered unwanted comfort. He just made sure she had privacy for her tears and that the supply closet door was locked from the inside when she needed it. Some pain required solitude to process properly. He saw Marcus Williams, the security guard who checked the same door handle 3 times every round because his Marine Corps training wouldn't let him believe in the security of a single verification. Marcus was 55 years old, a Vietnam veteran who'd served 2 tours in I Corps, the northernmost military region of South Vietnam where the fighting was particularly brutal and the enemy particularly determined. Marcus had come home to a country that wasn't sure it wanted to acknowledge his service, found work in private security, and spent 40 years learning to live with memories that civilian life had no context for understanding. His obsessive checking of locks and protocols wasn't paranoia, it was the survival mechanism of a man who'd learned that failing to verify security could get people killed. James understood all of them because he carried his own collection of invisible wounds. His own reasons for choosing the night shift where memories felt safer in the darkness, where the work was solitary and the questions were few. His uniform told no story that anyone could read. Simple navy blue coveralls, worn but always clean, pressed every Sunday in the basement laundry room of his small apartment building. The coveralls bore no patches, no insignia, no indication that the man wearing them had once carried different colors in places where uniforms meant the difference between friend and enemy. Steel-toed boots that never squeaked, never announced his presence before he chose to reveal it. He'd learned that lesson in jungles where a single misplaced footstep could trigger an ambush, where silence was both a weapon and a defense. The boots were comfortable, practical, and as unremarkable as everything else about his carefully constructed civilian identity. A name tag that simply read J. Mitchell with no title, no rank, no indication of the warrior hidden beneath the maintenance worker facade. James had spent 30 years making sure nobody asked what the J stood for, what his full name was, where he'd worked before the hospital, what his story was. Questions led to conversations, conversations led to connections, and connections led to complications he wasn't prepared to handle. On his left wrist, he wore a Timex watch that had stopped working on March 15, 1971, at exactly 0347 hours, but still kept perfect time in his memory. The moment when Corporal Danny Reeves took his last breath 6 miles from an extraction point that might as well have been on another planet. James had never had it repaired, never replaced it, never explained to anyone why he wore a broken watch that served no practical purpose. Time had stopped for him that morning in the jungle, and some part of him had never started moving again. The Minneapolis VA Medical Center at night was a different universe from its daylight counterpart. During the day, it bustled with the controlled chaos of modern medicine, doctors making rounds, nurses managing medications, therapists conducting sessions, administrators processing paperwork that would determine which veteran got which kind of help and how much it would cost. But at night, the building revealed its true nature. It became a sanctuary for the walking wounded, a place where America's invisible army came to fight battles that would never make headlines, never inspire movies, never be commemorated with monuments or parades. The night shift was quieter, but never truly silent. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm in the ICU, keeping damaged lungs functioning for veterans whose bodies had been compromised by chemicals they were never supposed to encounter, explosions they were never supposed to survive, stress that was never supposed to become permanent. Heart monitors beat their steady percussion throughout the cardiac wing, marking time between heartbeats and heartbreak for veterans whose hearts had been damaged not just by physical wounds but by the weight of experiences that civilian medicine was still learning to understand. Some of these men and women had literally died for their country and been brought back by battlefield medicine that was both miraculous and insufficient. In the psychiatric ward on the 5th floor, secured behind locked doors that were designed to look welcoming but functioned as barriers between the patients and a world they were still learning to trust again, men and women fought battles against enemies that lived inside their own minds. PTSD, survivor's guilt, moral injury, combat stress, clinical terms for spiritual wounds that had no visible scars but could destroy a person just as effectively as any bullet or bomb. James cleaned around it all with the methodical precision of a man who understood that details could mean the difference between healing and infection, between hope and despair, between a veteran finding peace and a veteran giving up entirely. He'd seen enough suicide attempts over the years to know that sometimes the smallest things, a clean room, a working light bulb, a trash can that wasn't overflowing, could provide just enough dignity to help someone choose to keep living. Patient rooms where men and women fought private wars against their own bodies, their own memories, their own guilt about surviving when others didn't. Corridors where families paced and prayed and tried to understand what their loved ones had experienced in places with names they couldn't pronounce, fighting enemies they couldn't imagine, for reasons that politicians couldn't explain clearly enough to make the sacrifice feel worthwhile. The orthopedic wing housed veterans learning to walk again on prosthetic legs, learning to write again with prosthetic hands, learning to live again in bodies that no longer matched their mental self-image. Some were young, recently injured, still believing that determination and physical therapy could restore them to their previous capabilities. Others were older, dealing with injuries that had been managed rather than healed, accepting limitations that would have been unthinkable when they were 19 and invincible. James mopped the floors where these veterans practiced walking with their new legs, cleaned the mirrors where they confronted their new reality, emptied the trash bins that contained the bandages and medical supplies that were part of their daily routine now. He did this work with the same attention to detail he brought to every other part of his job, understanding that these veterans deserved clean, safe spaces for their recovery. The psychiatric wing required a different kind of attention. These patients were fighting invisible enemies, memories that felt more real than the present moment, guilt that no amount of rational thinking could diminish, fears that had saved their lives in combat but made civilian life nearly impossible. Some of them had been in and out of this ward multiple times, cycling between periods of stability and crisis as they struggled to find medications and therapies that could provide lasting relief. James had learned to recognize the signs of impending crisis, the pacing, the sleeplessness, the way certain patients would suddenly become obsessed with details like the exact placement of furniture in their rooms or the precise timing of medication schedules. He'd alert the nursing staff when he noticed these patterns, though he never explained how he knew what to look for. Some knowledge came from experience that couldn't be easily shared. Never once in 30 years had James failed to show up for his shift. Not when he had pneumonia that should have put him in bed for a week. Not when his apartment was broken into and trashed by someone looking for drug money. Not when his sister died in a car accident and he was the only family member left to handle the funeral arrangements. The hospital was his mission now, these veterans were his responsibility, and Marines didn't abandon their posts because of personal problems. He never spoke unless spoken to, maintaining the professional distance that allowed him to do his job without getting emotionally entangled in situations he couldn't fix. When Dr. Patricia Huang, the night shift supervisor, made her rounds at 2 a.m., he would nod respectfully and continue his work without interruption. Dr. Huang was competent, caring, and overworked, responsible for managing a staff that was always understaffed and patients who deserved more attention than the system could provide. When orderlies pushed gurneys through the halls, rushing to respond to medical emergencies or transport patients for procedures, James would step aside with military courtesy, understanding the urgency of their mission and the importance of staying out of their way. He'd learned in the Marines that supporting the mission sometimes meant being invisible, and he applied that lesson to his civilian work. When patients called out in the darkness, lost in nightmares that blended memory with medication, reality with flashbacks, past with present, James would alert the nursing staff immediately and then disappear back into the shadows where he belonged. He knew enough about combat trauma to recognize a crisis, but he also knew that his job was to enable others to provide the help he couldn't give. Invisible service. The Marines had taught him that lesson in operations where success was measured by the absence of evidence that American forces had ever been in the area, where the best possible outcome was that nobody would ever know what they had done to keep their country safe. The hospital would never know about that training, never understand that their quiet janitor moved through these halls with the same precision he'd once used to navigate enemy territory, observe hostile forces, and complete missions that required him to be present without being noticed. But some skills never fade, some training never stops being useful, and some warriors never really leave the battlefield, they just find new ways to serve. Tuesday night, February 15, 2024. Outside, snow fell in thick, heavy flakes that turned Minneapolis into a hushed landscape of white and shadow. The kind of brutal Minnesota winter night that made people grateful for warm buildings, steady jobs, and the simple fact of being alive and sheltered. The temperature was 14 degrees below zero, cold enough to kill the unprepared, cold enough to make every breath visible and every step treacherous. James began his shift with the same ritual he'd followed for 3 decades, arriving at exactly 10:47 p.m., sitting in his truck for 3 minutes to finish his coffee and prepare his mind, clocking in at precisely 11 p.m. Supply closet inventory, equipment check, route planning executed with the precision of a military operation that had been rehearsed until it was automatic. Start with the ICU on the 7th floor, where the most critically injured veterans fought for their lives with the help of machines that could keep hearts beating and lungs breathing even when the body wanted to surrender. Worked systematically down to the emergency department on the ground floor, where new casualties arrived around the clock, not from combat anymore, but from the slower wars of addiction, homelessness, and civilian life that many veterans found harder to survive than their military service. Finish with the administrative offices on the second and third floors, where the real battles were fought with paperwork and policy instead of scalpels and medication. Where bureaucrats who'd never worn a uniform made decisions about which veterans deserved which benefits, how much help they could receive, and how long they would have to wait for treatment. Each floor had its own rhythm, its own needs, its own collection of broken warriors trying to heal in a system that was simultaneously the best veteran care in the world and completely inadequate for the magnitude of the problems it was supposed to solve. James knew the patterns, understood the flow, had learned to work around the emergencies and crises that were part of hospital life. At exactly 11:47 p.m., while James was mopping the main corridor on the third floor, the sound that would change everything echoed through the building, the sharp wail of an ambulance siren cutting through the winter night like a knife. Growing closer with each second, accompanied by the deeper rumble of the ambulance engine working hard against the snow and ice that made every emergency call more dangerous. James paused in his mopping, listening with the trained ear of someone who'd learned to read the nuances of approaching vehicles. This siren had urgency to it, the kind of sustained note that meant serious trauma, not just a routine transport. He'd heard thousands of sirens over 30 years, and this one made him pay attention. The paramedics burst through the emergency entrance doors like a military assault team, their voices cutting through the hospital's mechanical hum with sharp, professional urgency that reminded James of radio communications in combat zones. Quick, precise, focused on essential information that could mean the difference between life and death. 26-year-old male, motor vehicle accident on I-94 eastbound near the 35W interchange, conscious and responsive but showing signs of shock. Compound fracture left tibia with significant blood loss, possible concussion, vitals stable but blood pressure dropping steadily. Patient reports military service, says he's allergic to morphine, requesting non-opioid pain management. James pressed himself against the wall as they rushed past, gurney wheels spinning against the polished linoleum, paramedics calling out medical information to the trauma team that was already assembling in the emergency bay. Standard procedure for him: stay invisible, stay out of the way, let the medical professionals do their job while he did his. The emergency bay erupted into controlled chaos. Dr. Martinez, the head of emergency medicine, barking orders to nurses who moved with practiced efficiency. X-ray technicians wheeling portable machines into position. Laboratory technicians drawing blood samples for immediate analysis. The kind of coordinated response that could save lives when every second counted. But something made James look more closely than usual. Maybe it was professional curiosity after 3 decades of watching broken people get put back together. Maybe it was the mention of military service that caught his attention. Maybe it was just instinct, the same sixth sense that had kept him alive in places where looking at the wrong thing at the wrong time could get you killed, but ignoring the right thing at the right time could get your teammates killed. The patient was young, probably late 20s, with the kind of clean-cut appearance that spoke of recent military discipline even in civilian clothes. Short brown hair, clean-shaven face now twisted with pain and confusion from the accident. His jeans were torn and blood-soaked, revealing the compound fracture that had the trauma team's immediate attention. Road rash covered his hands and arms where he tried to break his fall when his car started spinning. But what froze James Mitchell in place, what made his mop handle slip from fingers that hadn't trembled since 1971, wasn't the injuries or the blood or the controlled chaos of the trauma response. It was the tattoo on the patient's right forearm. Even through the blood and road dirt and the harsh fluorescent emergency lighting, even from 30 feet away, James could see it with perfect clarity. Black ink on pale skin, professionally done by someone who understood that military tattoos carried meaning that went beyond mere decoration. A trident piercing through a skull, with wings spread wide behind the image like a promise of death delivered from above. Below it, in careful script that had probably cost extra and definitely meant everything, Semper Fidelis. Force Recon. United States Marine Corps. The brotherhood James had left behind in a jumble that didn't exist on any official map, carried by a man who was young enough to be his son but old enough to have seen combat, to have earned the right to wear that particular mark. The mop handle clattered to the floor with a sound that echoed off the corridor walls like a gunshot in church. The noise was loud enough that one of the paramedics glanced back over his shoulder, scanning for the source of the disturbance. But James had already melted back into the shadows where he belonged, his heart pounding with a rhythm he hadn't felt since the day he'd carried Danny Reeves 6 miles through hell. That tattoo. He knew that tattoo. Not this exact needlework, not this specific artist's interpretation, but the same mark, the same meaning, the same brotherhood that had defined the best and worst years of his life. The same symbol that had gone home to Texas on the body of Corporal Danny Reeves while James came home to Minnesota with nothing but survivor's guilt and a silence that had lasted 53 years, 2 months, and 18 days. Laos, 1971. The mission that officially never happened, conducted by Marines who were never there, in a country America was never supposed to touch. Classified at the secret level then, classified at the top secret level now, probably classified forever because some operations are too sensitive to acknowledge even decades after they stop mattering to anyone except the men who lived them and the families who lost them. James was 22 years old, barely 6 months past his 19th birthday when he'd raised his right hand in a recruiting office in Duluth and sworn an oath to defend a constitution he'd barely read and a country he was still learning to understand. Scared but trained, carrying equipment that connected him to a command structure half a world away and a lifetime of responsibility that would follow him home whether he survived the war or not. The mission was simple in concept, impossibly dangerous in execution. Insert a 3-man force recon team deep into enemy-controlled territory, locate and report on North Vietnamese supply routes that were keeping the war going, then extract without leaving any evidence that American forces had ever been in the area. No support, no backup, no rescue if things went wrong. Just 3 Marines with enough ammunition and rations to survive for a week, enough communications equipment to report what they found, and enough training to hopefully make it home alive. His team leader was Corporal Danny Reeves, 24 years old from a place called Cedar Park, just outside Austin, Texas. The kind of small town where high school football mattered more than national politics and military service was considered an honor rather than an obligation, a family tradition rather than a last resort. Danny was built like a linebacker and steady as bedrock, the kind of Marine who inspired confidence just by being present, who made difficult decisions look easy and dangerous situations feel manageable. Danny had gotten his force recon tattoo 2 weeks before deployment, during their last night of authorized leave in Da Nang, when they'd been given 72 hours to decompress before heading into the field. The 3 of them, Danny, James, and Tommy Kowalski from Detroit, had found a tattoo parlor that catered specifically to American servicemen, run by a Vietnamese artist who understood that American soldiers wanted their ink to mean something deeper than just decoration. "It's not about being tough," Danny had said, showing off the fresh needlework while they shared warm Budweiser and tried not to think too hard about what was waiting for them in the jungle. "Any fool can act tough for a few minutes when people are watching. This is about being remembered. If something happens to me out there, if I don't make it home to Texas, this mark will tell them who I was." Force Recon. Semper Fi. Part of something bigger than just Danny Reeves from Cedar Park. Tommy had laughed, called him superstitious, said the tattoo would probably jinx them all and get them killed before they completed their first mission. James hadn't said anything at the time, just studied the ink and wondered if he was brave enough to make the same commitment, to mark his body with a symbol that would identify him as a warrior even if he died nameless in an unmarked grave. In the end, he'd gotten the same tattoo the next night, reasoning that if Danny was right about being remembered, he wanted to be remembered as someone who'd served with honor. If Danny was wrong, well, at least they'd be wrong together, and there were worse things than dying alongside your brothers. The 3rd member of their team was Lance Corporal Tommy Kowalski, 20 years old, from the east side of Detroit where surviving to adulthood was its own kind of combat training. Tommy was small, quick, and absolutely fearless in the way that only comes from growing up in places where fear gets you killed faster than bullets do. He was their point man, responsible for navigation and early warning, the guy who would see trouble first and hopefully give them enough warning to deal with it. The mission went bad on day 4 of what was supposed to be a 7-day reconnaissance patrol. They were 23 miles inside Laos, moving parallel to a suspected North Vietnamese supply route, gathering intelligence that would never appear in any official report but might save American lives somewhere down the line. The jungle was triple canopy thick, so dense that they couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction, so humid that their uniforms never dried, so alien that it felt like operating on another planet. They'd been successful for 3 days, identifying supply caches, documenting troop movements, calling in coordinates for B-52 strikes that would obliterate the evidence of their presence along with the enemy supplies. The mission was going exactly according to plan, which should have been their first warning that something was about to go wrong. The ambush came at dawn on the 4th day, just as James was setting up the radio for their scheduled communication window with base camp. Automatic weapons fire from 2 directions, close enough that he could see muzzle flashes through the jungle undergrowth, sustained enough that he knew this wasn't a chance encounter with a patrol. This was a planned operation, an ambush that had been waiting for them. Danny and Tommy took cover behind a fallen tree while James dove for the radio, trying to get a distress signal transmitted before their communication window closed and left them completely cut off from any possible support. The radio was their lifeline, their only connection to a world that could send help, and losing it would mean dying alone in a jungle that would never give up their bodies. Danny took 2 rounds to the chest before James could finish the transmission. High-velocity rounds that punched through his flak jacket like it was made of paper, spinning him around and dropping him into the mud and rotting leaves that carpeted the jungle floor. The impact sounded like someone hitting a side of beef with a baseball bat, and Danny's eyes went wide with surprise before the pain hit and he started screaming. Tommy tried to return fire, tried to provide cover so James could reach Danny, but caught a sniper's bullet in the head 10 seconds later. One shot, perfectly placed, and Tommy Kowalski from Detroit just stopped existing, his finger still on the trigger of his M16, his last breath coming out as a sigh that sounded almost peaceful. James found himself alone in a jungle that wanted to kill him, 6 miles from the nearest extraction point, with a radio that was more damaged than functional and a team leader who was bleeding out in his arms. Danny was still conscious, still trying to give orders, still being the Marine Corps leader even as his life leaked away into the Vietnamese soil that would never give him back to Texas. "Get home, Mitchell," Danny whispered, blood frothing at the corners of his mouth, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Complete the mission. Get home and tell them we did our job. Tell them it mattered." James Mitchell carried Corporal Danny Reeves for 6 miles through a jungle that seemed designed by hell itself specifically to prevent human survival. 6 miles of mud and blood and prayers to a God who seemed to be looking the other way. 6 miles of slipping on wet rocks, pushing through vegetation that cut like razor wire, following compass headings that might or might not lead to salvation. Danny died in his arms 2 miles from the extraction point, just as James heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the jungle canopy. His last words weren't about home or family or the girl he'd planned to marry when he got back to Texas. They were about the tattoo on his arm, make sure they know what this means, before the light went out of his eyes forever and left James carrying a dead friend toward a rendezvous that no longer mattered. The extraction went smooth. Professional, efficient, no questions asked about why Corporal Mitchell was carrying 2 body bags instead of walking beside 2 living Marines. Danny and Tommy went home in flag-draped coffins. James got a Purple Heart he never wore, a Bronze Star he never displayed, and a lifetime of silence about what had happened in a jungle that didn't officially exist. The nightmares started 6 months after he got home, after he'd been discharged and was trying to figure out what civilian life was supposed to look like for someone who'd spent his formative years learning to kill people efficiently and survive in environments designed to prevent survival. Danny's voice calling for help. Tommy's face frozen in surprise. The weight of carrying a dead friend through hostile territory while trying not to become a casualty himself. The VA doctors called it survivor's guilt, as if giving it a name made it easier to understand or treat. James called it the price of coming home when better men didn't, and he paid that price every day for 53 years. Now, 53 years later, in a Minneapolis hospital corridor that smelled of disinfectant instead of jungle rot, that same tattoo was staring back at him from another young Marine's arm. Force Recon. Semper Fidelis. The brotherhood that transcended time, geography, wars, and the particular hells that tried to break the men who answered when their country called. James picked up his mop with hands that shook for the first time in decades. His invisible armor, perfected over 30 years of night shifts and careful solitude, had developed a crack that threatened to split wide open and reveal everything he'd spent 3 decades learning to hide. He continued his rounds, but his routine was broken, his mental discipline scattered like leaves in a storm that had been building for over 50 years. The trauma team worked on Marine Corporal Michael Torres for 3 hours and 17 minutes. James found reasons to pass by the emergency bay, catching glimpses through observation windows, picking up fragments of conversation from doctors and nurses who didn't know their janitor was listening with more than professional interest. 26 years old, recently discharged from active duty after 6 years of service that had included 2 combat deployments to Afghanistan. Living in St. Paul with his older sister while he figured out what civilian life was supposed to look like for someone whose job skills included close-quarters combat, weapons maintenance, and keeping people alive in situations where most humans wouldn't survive 5 minutes. The car accident wasn't his fault. A semi-truck had jackknifed on black ice near the I-94 and 35W interchange, one of the most dangerous stretches of road in Minnesota during winter weather. The truck clipped Torres's Honda Civic, sent him spinning across 2 lanes of traffic like a pinball bouncing between bumpers made of steel and concrete and physics that didn't care about good intentions or military service. The compound fracture looked worse than it actually was, the clean break that would heal properly with surgery, physical therapy, and the kind of patience that Marines weren't famous for possessing. No internal bleeding, no brain injury, no damage that couldn't be repaired with time and modern medicine, and a healthcare system that was actually designed to help veterans instead of processing them through bureaucratic mazes. Lucky, Dr. Martinez told the surgical team. Could have been much worse. Another 6 inches to the right and that semi would have hit his door instead of his bumper. We'd be having a very different conversation. James knew about luck. He understood how thin the line was between coming home and not coming home, between walking into an ambush and walking away from one, between being the guy who carries and being the guy who gets carried. He'd spent 50 years being grateful for luck that felt more like a curse, surviving when better men didn't, carrying guilt that never got lighter no matter how many years passed or how many floors he mopped in penance. At 3:23 a.m., they moved Michael Torres to room 418 in the orthopedic wing. 4th floor, quiet corridor, single beds for recovery patients who needed more monitoring than the general ward could provide but weren't critical enough for intensive care. James watched the orderlies wheel him past, noting room number, medical equipment requirements, the peaceful expression of a man finally free from pain thanks to modern pharmaceuticals and the kind of medical care that Danny Reeves never had the chance to receive. James finished his shift at 7 a.m. as always. Clocked out with the same precision he brought to clocking in, drove his F-150 home through morning traffic to the small 1-bedroom apartment in northeast Minneapolis where he'd lived alone for 12 years. The apartment was clean but sparse, furnished with the bare minimum necessary for survival: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a television he rarely watched, and kitchen appliances that served their purpose without requiring attention or maintenance. No photographs on the walls. No military memorabilia displayed on shelves. No evidence of the life he'd lived before becoming the invisible man who cleaned hospitals and carried other people's secrets. The only exception was a shadow box hanging in his small living room, containing a carefully folded American flag, the flag from Danny Reeves' funeral, given to him by a family who wanted someone to remember their son who died for a mission that never happened. But sleep wouldn't come. James sat in his kitchen, drinking black coffee from the same chipped mug he'd owned for 15 years, staring at that flag and thinking about tattoos and coincidences and the way the past never really stayed buried no matter how deep you tried to bury it. That evening, James returned to work 30 minutes early. Unusual behavior that might have raised questions from a supervisor who paid closer attention, but the night shift coordinator trusted him completely. James Mitchell was the most reliable employee the Minneapolis VA Medical Center had ever had, never sick, never late, never complained, never caused problems, never required management attention or intervention. The kind of worker every institution dreams of and rarely finds: competent, dependable, invisible until you need him, essential in ways that don't show up on performance evaluations or budget reports. He started his rounds on the 4th floor, deviating from his normal routine for the first time in years. Room 418 was quiet when James approached, pushing his cart with the same careful precision he brought to every other aspect of his work. Michael Torres lay sleeping, his left leg elevated and wrapped in a surgical cast that ran from ankle to knee, supported by a complex arrangement of pulleys and weights that kept the bones properly aligned while they healed. Pain medication had finally won the war against adrenaline and trauma, giving his body the unconsciousness it needed to begin the long process of healing that would take months to complete and years to fully accept. His chart, hanging at the foot of the bed in a clear plastic sleeve, told a story James recognized all too well: young Marine, combat veteran, trying to adjust to civilian life one day at a time, one challenge at a time, one small victory at a time. James entered the room quietly, ostensibly to empty the small trash bin beside the bed and replace the liner with a fresh bag. Standard procedure, part of his normal rounds, nothing that would attract attention or require explanation to anyone who might ask. But in reality, he needed to see the tattoo again, to confirm what his eyes had told him in the emergency department 12 hours earlier, to face the ghost that had followed him home from a jungle that wasn't supposed to exist. The tattoo was there, exactly as James remembered it. Perhaps faded slightly under the hospital's harsh fluorescent lighting, but unmistakable in its meaning and its craftsmanship. Force Recon Trident, wings spread wide like a promise of death delivered from above. Semper Fidelis script below, the same mark of brotherhood that Danny Reeves had carried to his grave in Texas soil 53 years ago. You recognize it, don't you? James spun around, nearly knocking over his cart in surprise. Michael Torres was awake, watching him with brown eyes that were clear and alert despite the pain medication flowing through his foreline. Alert, aware, studying James with the kind of trained observation that Marines learn to apply to their environment automatically, constantly, as a matter of survival. I was just emptying the trash, James started, falling back on 30 years of practiced invisibility, 30 years of being the maintenance worker who didn't warrant attention or conversation. No, Michael said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that comes from military training and combat experience. You were looking at this. He gestured toward his tattoo with his uninjured hand. You know what it means. You know what it represents. You know what it costs. James set down the trash bin with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, given that his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. For 3 decades, he'd perfected the art of being invisible, of moving through the world without leaving footprints or drawing attention or answering questions about who he was or where he'd been. Now, under the steady gaze of a wounded Marine who was young enough to be his son, his carefully constructed armor was useless. What year did you get that? James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Got the ink in 2019, right before my second deployment to Afghanistan. Helmand Province, some of the heaviest fighting since the war started. My team leader said it was bad luck to get tattoos before deployment, but I wanted something that would identify me if. Michael's voice trailed off, but James understood the unfinished thought. I meant, when did you serve? 2017 to 2023. 6 years active duty, 2 combat deployments, more close calls than I like to think about. What about you? James hesitated, looking toward the door as if calculating escape routes, measuring the distance between his current position and the safety of anonymity that waited in the corridor. Then, slowly, he rolled up the sleeve of his coveralls. The tattoo was there, identical to Michael's but faded and stretched with age, the black ink turned gray by decades of wear, the sharp lines softened by time and weather and the weight of carrying secrets that were too heavy to share. 1969 to 1972. Southeast Asia. Classified operations that officially never happened. Michael's eyes widened slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a tone of respect that James hadn't heard directed at him in over 50 years. Force Recon? 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion. Deep Jungle Operations in Laos. The kind of missions that never appeared in any official report, never got written up in history books, never earned medals that could be displayed publicly. The room fell silent except for the steady beep of Michael's heart monitor and the distant hum of the hospital's ventilation system working to maintain the careful environment that promoted healing. 2 generations of Marines, separated by 50 years of war and peace and the particular kinds of hell that each generation had been called upon to endure, connected by ink and understanding and the weight of experiences that civilians would never comprehend. "Does it hurt?" James asked. "The leg? Not too bad with all the medication they're giving me. Modern pain management is pretty incredible compared to what we had in the field." "No," James said, looking directly into the young Marine's eyes with an intensity that seemed to peer straight into his soul. "Inside. The part that doesn't show up on X-rays or CT scans. The part that keeps you awake at night even when your body is exhausted." Michael looked away from James's gaze, toward the window where dawn was beginning to break over Minneapolis, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink that reminded him of mornings in Afghanistan when his team would return from night operations and watch the sun rise over mountains that held too many secrets. "Every day," he said quietly. "Some days worse than others. Some days I can almost forget, and then something happens, a car backfires, a helicopter flies overhead, someone drops something heavy, and I'm right back there. You know how it is. Does it get easier?" James's answer came from 50 years of carrying his own wounds, his own guilt, his own memories of friends who didn't make it home and missions that succeeded at costs that were never calculated in the official reports. "No. But you learn to carry it differently. The weight becomes part of you, like scar tissue that's stronger than the original skin but never quite as flexible. And sometimes you find someone else who understands what that weight feels like, and it gets a little easier to carry." They talked until the day shift arrived at 7 a.m., filling the room with the sounds of nurses checking vitals and doctors making rounds and the general bustle of a hospital coming fully to life. They talked about Afghanistan and Vietnam, about missions that couldn't be discussed in detail with civilians and friends whose names were carved in black granite instead of spoken aloud at family gatherings. They talked about the invisible war that continued long after the fighting stopped, the battle against memories that felt more real than the present moment, guilt that never completely faded, and a civilian world that thanked them for their service but never quite understood what that service had actually cost. Michael told James about his team leader, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, who'd stepped on an improvised explosive device during their second deployment, saving his squad but losing both legs in the process. About the way civilian life felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit properly, like trying to speak a language he'd forgotten how to use effectively. About nightmares that medication could dull but never eliminate. About the way certain sounds or smells could transport him instantly back to situations where the wrong decision would get people killed and the right decision might get people killed too, just more slowly and with better paperwork. James found himself sharing things he'd never spoken aloud to anyone about Danny Reeves and Tommy Kowalski, about carrying a dead friend through 6 miles of jungle that seemed designed specifically to prevent human survival, about survivor's guilt that had followed him home and never completely let go. About choosing the night shift because darkness felt safer than daylight, because the work was solitary and the questions were fewer. About spending 30 years cleaning up after other people's pain while carefully ignoring his own, about the way helping other veterans heal felt like the closest thing to penance he could manage. "Why didn't you ever talk to anyone?" Michael asked. "VA counselors, chaplains, other veterans who might understand?" "Different generation," James replied. "When I came home, you were supposed to just readjust automatically. Suck it up, move on, be grateful you survived when others didn't. Nobody talked about PTSD or trauma counseling or any of that. You just carried it. Quietly. Forever. And you've been carrying it alone for 50 years? Until tonight." When James left that morning, Michael called out to him from his hospital bed, his voice carrying across the room with the kind of authority that comes naturally to Marines who've learned to make themselves heard over gunfire and explosions and the general chaos of combat operations. "Will you be here tomorrow night?" James paused at the door, looking back at the young Marine who'd managed to crack open 30 years of carefully maintained silence with nothing more than a tattoo and the willingness to ask the right questions. Every night, son. Every night until you don't need me to be here anymore. Some connections transcend time, rank, and circumstance. In a hospital room, between a janitor and a patient, two warriors found something they'd been searching for without knowing they needed it. Brotherhood. Understanding. Recognition. The knowledge that they weren't alone in carrying the weight of service and sacrifice, that somewhere in the world, someone else understood the true cost of coming home when others didn't, of surviving when survival felt more like a punishment than a blessing. James Mitchell never asked to be a hero. He never wanted recognition or thanks or parades or monuments. He just showed up, night after night for 30 years, carrying his memories in silence, cleaning up after other people's pain while carefully avoiding his own, serving in the only way he knew how to serve. But sometimes, the greatest healing comes not from medicine or therapy or the passage of time. Sometimes it comes from being seen by someone who recognizes your scars, someone who carries the same invisible wounds, someone who understands that the war never really ends, it just moves from the battlefield to the heart, from the jungle to the hospital corridor, from the past to the present moment where two Marines can look at each other's tattoos and know, without saying a word, that they've found their brother. So I ask you, have you ever met someone like James Mitchell? Someone serving quietly in the background, carrying invisible wounds, healing others while hiding their own pain behind uniforms that don't reveal the battles they've fought. Someone whose service didn't end when they left the military, but continued in different forms, in different places, with different tools but the same commitment to something larger than themselves? Share their story in the comments. Let's honor the quiet heroes who walk among us, the ones who never ask for recognition but deserve our respect and our remembrance. Thank you for watching The Human Stories. If this story touched you, hit that subscribe button and help us keep these voices alive. Because every veteran's story matters, especially the ones they never tell. And sometimes, in the silence between heartbeats, in the space between night and morning, two souls find each other and realize they're not alone anymore. The healing begins when the silence ends. And sometimes, it takes 50 years to find someone worth breaking that silence for.